You are watching original video by truthdig.com. For more information and resources, visit us at truthdig.com.
It is naive and foolish to think the United States meddling in this situation had nothing to do with this. Of course it did.
Yeah.
Everything from breaking our promises about how far east NATO would go to the Aegis missiles in Poland and so forth. However, I am not of the belief that any of that justifies the brutal imperialism of Vladimir Putin. I'm not naive about the U.S. war machine, the military-industrial complex, or the predatory imperialistic tendencies of that machinery.
Yeah.
But neither do I underestimate the significance, fail to reject the imperialism of Vladimir Putin. It's a proxy war on many levels, yes. And there's a lot more to say about it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that what happened in the Ukraine in 2014 was strictly analogous to Mossadegh in Iran. I don't believe that this was a straight-on American coup and that Zelensky is the Shah of Iran. When you look at the way the Ukrainians are fighting, the spirit, the passion, and the sacrifice with which those people are fighting, you don't fight that way if you're nothing but an agent for the U.S. government.
Sure.
They're fighting for their country. And I believe that you can recognize the meddling of the U.S. government and at the same time argue that sovereignty matters here.
Mm-hmm.
Both can be true. Clearly, there has to be a negotiated settlement here. It's the only possibility.
Yeah.
That goes without saying. But I would like to see it be a negotiated settlement in which there is still a country called Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Denmark has offered to be host to a summit. They have correctly said that it makes no sense to host such a summit if it only involves Ukraine and its allies.
Right.
In order for the summit to matter, it would have to include China, it would have to include India, it would have to include Brazil.
Yeah.
You know, this has to be global. The United States, this is no longer a unipolar world. The current economic system, and this is about economics,
Yeah.
the current economic paradigm wishes to divorce moral consideration from any public policy, domestic or international.
Yeah.
That's not hard-headed. That's sociopathic.
How do
Franklin
you-
Roosevelt
Mm-hmm.
wrote that we have to do more than end wars. We must end the beginnings of all wars. And that's why he was envisioning, at the time of his death, he was already envisioning the establishment of the United Nations.
Yeah.
And then, of course, his wife, his widow, would be our first ambassador because they were actually hoping, just after World War I, right? It was the war that would end all wars.
Yeah.
And so the world was completely shocked when, a few decades later, they're back at it again.
Mm-hmm.
And they were hoping that they were establishing a post-World War II order that would prevent some of the horror that we're seeing now. The Department of Peace is the idea that we must proactively create conditions of greater, that will establish greater probability of peace. And of course, that means humanitarian efforts and it means justice.
Mm-hmm.
In the absence of which violence and conflict are almost inevitable. Poverty is a moral issue. The preemptive invasion of a country that has done nothing to you is a moral issue. How we are treating the planet, the lack of reverence, is a moral issue. How we treat animals is a moral issue. And that's what I mean about the over-secularization, for exactly the reasons that you just said. Where people are coming from in an effort in a lot of ways determines the power with which they pursue their goal. And if your politics is only transactional, the way you described, if it's only about CO2 emissions and never about reverence towards the earth, then you're stuck in a transactional political model that, if anything is clear now, does not work.
Yeah.
So Dr. King was a Baptist preacher. Bobby Kennedy Sr. talked about how we were fighting for the soul of America. Many of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement were Quakers.
Yeah.
A lot of the abolitionist movement, the white abolitionist movement, emerged from the early evangelical churches in New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the larger historical trajectory of social justice movements in the United States, you see how often and how deeply they emerge from religious circles. Now, today, the politics of organized religious institutions, such as the Christian right, clearly has less to do with spiritual principle and more to do with ideology, which in many cases is the opposite of spiritual principle.
Mm-hmm.
But that does not mean that people don't recognize that something is wrong at the center of things. The 21st century paradigm mindset is much more holistic, much more whole person.
Mm-hmm.
It no longer divorces the human consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
materialization. And in fact, everything we're talking about here with bringing back spirituality is the recognition that the mind divorced from moral principle is dangerous.
Yeah.
That's what a sociopath is. And sociopathic behavior is deadly on a personal level, and sociopathic behavior is deadly on a collective level as well. If you have an economic system, which we now do, prevailing in the United States, in which short-term economic gain, short-term profit maximization for huge corporations
Yeah.
is placed before the health and the safety and the well-being of people, of animals, of the environment,
Yeah.
of the species, the life of the species, then you've got a huge problem on your hands. And that's exactly what is confronting us now. So you can look at political activism through a horizontal filter or through a vertical filter. If you're thinking on the horizontal, you go, well, how am I going to convince this group? Well, I'll say this to them. And how am I going to convince that group? So I'll say this to them. So you're always tempted to dumb down your message in order to get more people to understand. The political act, which to me has no particular integrity to it. Mm-hmm. If you look at political activism vertically, you're not thinking in terms of how to go wide. You're thinking in terms of how to go deep. Mm. You're thinking in terms not of who to convince, but how to say it as well as you can. And the conviction with which you say it, because you mean it, because you are as deep as you can be within yourself, becomes a force multiplier. Mm-hmm. The majority of people did not wake up one day and say, let's free the slaves. The majority of people did not wake up one day and say, let's give women the right to vote. Yeah. The majority of people did not wake up one day and say, let's desegregate the American South. This gets into the difference. I was reading, I don't remember where. Oh, I do remember what I was reading. It made me think about the difference between the provocateur, the activist, and the politician. Mm-hmm. So the provocateur, you know what? It was a book about Lincoln. So the provocateurs were the people who were passionate anti-slavery voices early on. Everybody thought they were crazy because life is usually changed at the beginning by a few people considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time. Yeah. That's the provocateur. They're necessary, though. They open the space. And then, because they open that space, the activist comes in next. But the activist is someone who heard the message that was articulated by the provocateur. Mm-hmm. right?
Yep.
And then once there are enough activists to create more political possibility, that's where the politician comes in. You know, Lincoln is a perfect example. Lincoln was not an early anti-slavery provocateur.
Mm-hmm.
He was not an early anti-slavery activist, although there is a quote of his from early in his career, which I find fascinating. He did say early in his career, if I ever get a chance to hit it, I'm going to hit it hard. Bernie Sanders was clearly a provocateur.
Yeah.
He was a politician as well, but ultimately his greatest success has been as a provocateur. He opened the space by opening the conversation.
Yeah.
And creating the political field that a bunch of activists rushed in. And now the question is, will we let a politician actually assume the political power that has not yet been achieved?
Yeah.
I've been a huge Bernie Sanders fan and continue to be. What I began to see in my career, which began in the 80s, I began to see in the late 90s. So I started speaking in the early 80s, in 1983.
Mm-hmm.
And I started seeing something in the late 90s, which totally makes sense, because then you're talking about a 20-year, the full flowering, the evil flower, right?
Yeah.
Brought forth by, by trickle-down economics.
Yeah.
I began to see an almost ubiquitous despair that I had been involved in a lot of things like AIDS activism and peace work, and up close and personal with people whose lives were in very rough shape. The news had come back. The test results weren't good. It was cancer. My child is on heroin. My husband left me. My company's gone bankrupt. All kinds of things that happen in people's lives.
Mm.
But I began to see a level of despair that didn't seem any longer in this country to be the exception, but rather almost the rule, a kind of feature and not a bug of American life.
Yeah.
And I realized it was because more often than not, of bad public policy. You know, you can say, all right, your therapist or your spiritual counselor, your minister, your rabbi is really going to help you through a rough time. But if you still have to work 3 jobs, the mental health crisis is a symptom. It is not a cause.
Yeah.
Much as pharmaceutical companies would like us to think differently.
Yeah.
So it is a symptom of a deeper level of despair. And we have to ask ourselves why. And it is ridiculous to underestimate the role that chronic economic anxiety plays in that.
Yeah.
So I began to see how many people did everything right in life, and they were struggling to survive in the richest country in the world. And I realized how different this was when I was growing up. And I thought, what's the difference? Well, the difference was because when you were growing up, there was a vital middle class. There was a thriving middle class. In the 1970s, the average American worker had decent benefits, could afford a car, could afford a house, could afford a yearly vacation, could afford for one parent to stay home if they wanted, and could afford to send their kids to college.
Yeah.
And when I was, in my 20s and the 70s, nobody had any money, but you didn't really need it,
Yeah.
We all knew, it's like, it just wasn't so hard. And so I began to realize later in the 1990s or in 2000, I thought, something's really wrong here. And I can start nonprofits, which I had. I'd done a lot of nonprofit work. And I thought, you know what? No amount of private charity can compensate for a basic lack of social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have it, politicians would say to me, Miss Williamson, what do you think we ought to do about the mental health crisis? And I remember saying to a senator, why don't you stop driving people crazy? Maybe that would help.
Yeah.
Maybe give them health care. Maybe let them not be burdened by these huge college loans, worry all the time about whether or not they could send their kids to college. Let them be able to own a home, get an education. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the people in those intimate settings have read that media.
Mm-hmm.
Has been influenced by the fairy dust thrown in their eyes by people who do not want my message taken seriously for their own purposes.
Yeah.
And so have created the wacky crystal lady image, woo-woo love lady caricature.
Yeah.
as a way of obstructing the deeper message of love. When you talk about the deeper message of love, who doesn't hear that?
Right.
Martin Luther King said, it's time to inject a new dimension of love into the veins of human civilization. By the way, I don't hear anybody criticizing Cornel West for using that language.
Yeah.
Nobody criticizes Cory Booker for using that language. Well, first of all, democracy is a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's significant and ultimately good that there are 3 anti-establishment campaigns making it clear whether the DNC is ready to admit it or not.
Yeah.
That the rumblings underneath the surface shall not be silenced.
Right.
That they cannot keep the lid on the voice of rage and calls for change that are coming up from the bottom of things.
Right.
There's a political earthquake that is only just beginning to happen in this country. And the little lines in the earth are beginning to form.
Yeah.
There is going to be change. We are living in revolutionary times, whether we like it or not. So we have 2 choices here. Things are not going to remain the same. They are going to break one way or the other. They're either going to break in the way of greater democracy and greater justice, or they are going to break in the direction of authoritarianism and dystopia. Those are our only 2 choices. We cannot idle in neutral much longer.
You are watching original video by truthdig.com. For more information and resources, visit us at truthdig.com.